Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff and I'm joined by Jared Nelson and also joined by the new stated clerk of Ileana Presbytery, the Right Reverend Scott Edberg. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to have you all.
Hey, hello.
Scott, how do you feel?
I feel like a new man. Things that I've dreamed for a very long time are finally realized. I get to move paper around, more paper. I'm just so excited to move more paper around because it's a hobby of mine. So, but no, I look forward to serving. We have some work to do in Ileana, and I'm hoping that I can help the Presbytery and its organization.
I think we're going to have to do a bonus episode where I interview you about all of your new task-oriented apps and things that you're putting to use in your new role. We could have Jared on there too, but he's just going to talk about Post-it notes the whole time. So I don't know.
Yeah, I'm starting to realize that if I don't schedule my time, I'm pretty organized with like spreadsheets, but if I don't schedule my time, I tend to waste my time. And so I'm trying to get better habits.
Well, you guys know that we've been walking through the General Assembly schedule in order to give newcomers an impression of the whole week and hopefully to give a good refresher to all of those who are the veterans out there. We've worked through a lot of the GA docket so far. We started on Monday and we've kind of been progressing through, but now we're going to back up a little bit and zoom in on two particular committee reports that take place, one on Wednesday morning and one on Thursday morning. And you've heard us mention them plenty of times in passing. Now you're actually going to finally learn about what they are. What we often call RPR, or the Review of Presbytery Records, and what we'll often call NOMCOM, or the Nominations Committee. And to help us out in our discussion today, we are happy to welcome back friend of the show, Steve Tipton. Steve, welcome. Thanks for helping us out today. Make things clear.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
Steve is some kind of expert on RPR. I actually can't remember the connection that you have to it. I'm sure you've served on it at some point, but you've got lots of good thoughts for us. And Jared's this year serving as the chairman of the nominations committee, and so he'll help us understand what's going on with that report. And so our plan of attack today is just to work through the basics of RPR and then do the same thing with NOMCOM. And so I'm really just going to sort of hand it over to Steve and let him begin to explain to us what is Review of Presbytery Records, what's the significance of it, the background, why is it something we should pay attention to, and maybe me and my buddies will just jump in and offer, questions, commentary, useless nonsense whenever we think it seems appropriate.
Look forward to the useless nonsense. Thank you.
Always.
So speaking of useless nonsense, first just again, thanks for having me on. Thanks for doing this series. I was thinking about my first General Assembly all the way back in Virginia Beach, 2010, I guess, whatever it was. But anyway, just thinking back to really being lost a lot of the times. Had some good guys around me that were able to point me in the right direction, but it can be overwhelming and bewildering and all the rest. So happy to talk about RPR. I was going back through my participation on that august body and started RPR in 2011. I was taking a spot for somebody who was serving in the midst of their 3-year term and was not able to make a meeting. And so I went as an alternate and just kept going back from 2011 through 2022, 12 times in a row on RPR. And then I'm going again this summer as the representative for Gulf Coast. So that'll make 13 times before too much longer. More than most have served on that committee, but I hope fewer than some. So in addition to just being on the committee that time, I've been a vice chair several times and then chaired the committee in 2018. And so pretty well versed in what it is and what it does. I wanted just to start off, though, with just a little bit of background to what the review and control is that RPR seeks to undertake on behalf of the Assembly. I'm going to kind of run through a number of BCO references. I'll give you the reference if someone wants to look it up in more detail. But But really, in one sense, it starts in BC 015 with the description that all ecclesial jurisdiction is joint in power, that we exercise that power not severally, but jointly. And then as well, alongside of that, 10:1, which says that this jurisdiction is exercised by presbyteries in graded courts. And so you have sessions, presbyteries, and the assembly. All of them, in one sense, are presbyteries in the sense that they're composed of presbyters, although the middle court obviously only has that name. But that is where that joint power of ecclesiastical jurisdiction is exercised in those various graded courts. So chapter 11 then talks a little bit about jurisdiction, and the phrase I'm sure everybody's well aware of through this podcast, that jurisdiction is ministerial and declarative. And then in 11:2, it has this series of statements that it makes. The first aspect of this is that court can make no rule binding conscience. But secondly, it does have the power to establish rules for the government, discipline, worship, and extension of the church. And so while these must always be agreeable to Scripture, there's this understanding that circumstantial details of those, the government of the church, discipline, worship, etc., those details are left to Christian prudence and the wisdom of church officers. But then as well, thirdly, that these courts do possess the right to require obedience to the laws of Christ, and even by extension to those laws, or rather to those rules, we might say, that are agreed upon together as a court. 11:3, this reminder again that the courts, this jurisdiction is one in nature, that all church courts have the same kind of rights and powers. In one sense, presbytery is just a big session, and the General Assembly is just a big presbytery in a sense. However, these courts differ only in one sense as the Constitution provides. And so, but you still see, an SJC at the General Assembly level is just a particular form of a judicial commission that a presbytery might have, that a session might even put together, as well as various committees and their functions and so on and so forth.
So technically, what is RPR? What type of committee is RPR?
I think it's a special committee, technically, memory serves. So like there are program committees and there are some other kind of committees that somebody else can come and talk about. But I think it's labeled under special committees.
Does that mean y'all get like T-shirts or something? Is that
no
special?
No? I could make a joke about a short bus, but I won't, because it would take several short buses to get us all there. So, so again, some of the differences, lower, session is going to ordain ruling elders, and a presbytery is going to ordain teaching elders, and a General Assembly is going to ordain no one. So some of those things. But one of the things that it talks about in 11:3 is this idea that disputed matters of doctrine or order come under the authority of higher courts. And 11:4 then specifically talks about how that happens. It comes under matters, not just disputed matters, but certainly including or not excluding disputed matters, come under the review and control of higher courts. So in 11, it talks about the General Assembly, or rather, the chapter 14 rather is about the General Assembly. And so it enumerates some of the powers of General Assembly to record or to review the records of presbytery, to take care that lower courts observe the Constitution, and to redress whatever they may have done which is contrary to order. Then chapter 39 is about the ways in which the actions or inactions of lower courts come under the jurisdiction of higher courts. One of those is what I would call normal and ordinary, which is review and control. And there are others that are occasional and extraordinary: appeals, complaints, and referrals. So in one sense, year after year after year, both presbyteries and the assembly must do review and control of lower courts through their minutes. And then when an appeal or a complaint or a referral arises, they take up those things And that's where the higher court exercises its jurisdiction over the lower court. I also wanted to read one other section from 39. This is, I think it's the first full sentence, although it is long and kind of Owenian in its length and breadth, but it's 39:3. And so I'll just read it. While affirming that Scripture is the supreme judge by which all controversies of religion are to be determined, Westminster Confession of Faith 110, and that the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church in America is, quote, subordinate to the Scriptures of the Old and New Testament, the inerrant Word of God, BCO Preface 3, and while affirming also that this Constitution is fallible, Westminster Confession of Faith 31:3, the Presbyterian Church in America affirms that this subordinate and fallible Constitution has been, quote, adopted by the Church, that's BCO Preface 3, and then another quote, as standard expositions of the teaching of Scripture in relation to both faith and practice, that's BCO 29:1, and as setting forth a form of government and discipline, quote, in conformity with the general principles of biblical polity, BCO 21-5.3. The reason why I bring that up is that we have to recognize that, yes, Scripture is our supreme authority, and we have subordinate standards, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the BCO. And yet, just as we affirm that Westminster Confession of Faith is our sort of standard exposition of Scripture, we also recognize that our BCO contains a form of government and discipline that is in conformity with the general principles of biblical polity. And so while there are circumstances in our polity that you cannot have a chapter and verse for, such as the number of days that you have to file an appeal, or even the process for an appeal, we are affirming as a church, and all men who take ordination vows are affirming that the form of government we actually do have, while not perfect and is fallible, is in conformity with the general principles of biblical polity. And that means then that the General Assembly, as the highest court in the PCA, has the duty and the responsibility to exercise both, again, as I called it, occasional and extraordinary control in cases of appeal, complaint, or reference, but that it has a duty and right and a responsibility to exercise that control generally and ordinarily. And the way that is done, the way in which we do that is through, ultimately through the review of records, although there's some other aspects to that I'll get into in just a second.
I think that's such a helpful point to make, Steve, about 39:3. We talked about it when we were going through Witherow, that the church in our polity, not only does the church have the authority to do the things that it's been given to do, like review and control would fall under that, but also those underneath that authority are responsible to obey and fall in line with what has been given. And so it's a wonderful section to reference that that this is expected and proper for us to follow because it conforms with what the Bible's given to us. Yeah.
Well, I think too that, tied to that, this was not just a sort of a sprint down memory lane or anything. But as I was thinking through this, I mean, just the idea that, all courts are one. They are graded in terms of, you might say, the circumstances of geographic dispersion and the various needs of different areas. But ultimately, the PCA is a denomination. It is a court. It is the General Assembly. And when we gather together, we make decisions and we make changes, or we try to make changes to the BCO or whatever else, that there's a sense in which the authority that we are exercising is the authority that Christ has given to the church as a whole, to our church. I mean, we're one expression of that as a whole. And so when that filters down to a presbytery, that presbytery then is acting, I'm going to use extra BCO language here, but is acting sort of as an agent of a part of the higher denomination. And while, yes, there are specific duties and requirements that are given to the presbytery, and let's not forget they're given to the presbyteries by the General Assembly in the Book of Church Order, and similar to the session, that requirement to conform all that they do to what the assembly has declared will be the way in which we go about doing these things is not optional. It's not, in one sense, it's not even voluntary. I mean, it's voluntary to the degree that it's a voluntary organization. I get that. But it is the right of every presbytery to conform its actions and even the way in which it conducts its meetings with what the BCO says, because the nature of the church's jurisdiction and authority is not several, even several in terms of presbyteries, but is one through its General Assembly.
So what you're saying is that presbyteries or sessions should not be getting mad because a session has their minutes reviewed by presbytery and the General Assembly has their minutes reviewed by, or their presbytery has their minutes reviewed by the General Assembly. In fact, this is what we signed up for.
Yeah, well, I'll come back around to that because I think there's two aspects that you just nailed one of them. But yeah, I mean, sessions, I think you find it more on the session level than the presbytery level where, sessions get very upset about the fact that they have to submit their minutes. And it's often, looked at as sort of meddling at best. I suppose the best word you might hear is meddling. But it really is, just part and parcel of what it means to be Presbyterian. And the more I think as churches and presbyteries and the assembly as a whole, the more we lean into this, I think the more we conform to our Presbyterian principles as a church. So any other thoughts or questions? Sorry. Seeing none.
Well, getting into, I think you have that as the overview of what the mandate is. How does that actually function? Because usually we don't get into that much detail at General Assembly. So you guys are meeting before that. How does that work, that this committee has all of these responsibilities for these minutes? What does it look like for RPR to meet and have a report for us at GA that we're going to see on the Wednesday of GA?
Yeah. Well, I'll get right to that. Ben might want to cut and paste here a little bit. I do want to.
No cutting and pasting. Sorry.
No cutting and pasting. Okay. I do want to talk just about one more chapter in the BCO real quick before we get to the process and
we'll just
how
make Jared ask his question all over again.
Okay,
and you just referenced sausage again, which you did incessantly the first time we had you on. That's not a comment, a bad comment. I'm praising you. I'm just saying that's a great phrase.
It's the origin of the Swiss Reformation. Come on.
Right. It's at the very roots of us as Presbyterians. There is sausage and a Bible and probably a cask of wine. All right. So chapter 40 then gives the BCO basis then for general review and control. What is it? What does it look like? Again, 40-1 just reminds us that this is a right and a duty of every higher court to review the minutes of the lower court. 40-2 then provides what specifically those higher courts are to do when they conduct that review. It lists 4 items, and each of them are separated, and they're all equally, or not equally, but they're all very important. First of all, that those actions were recorded correctly. Here is one of those areas, again, where there's a lot of angst sometimes from lower courts because, well, we did it right, we just didn't record it right, or, sort of what does it matter? Why is it so important to record it in a particular way? And if you've ever read minutes of any court that you were not present at, how just confusing minutes can be when they don't accurately record what happens. And you have no idea what they did, and they, coming back years later, are going to have no idea what they did, why they did it, what decisions were made, what amendments were made, et cetera. And so the recording is incredibly important because if it's not recorded correctly or properly, then there's no way to know whether it was done right or wrong. It gives rise to one of the statements that we like to make at RPR. If it's not in the minutes, it didn't happen. Or if it's recorded incorrectly, then the only thing we can assume is that it was done incorrectly, right? We only assume that you did it the way you recorded it. So correct recording is very important. But secondly, that it would be regular and in accordance with the Constitution. Regular here is not a biological function we're talking about, but really these things aren't irregular, right? It's not saying, okay, these things happen, when they're supposed to happen. That's not what it means, but rather that they're not irregular. They're not out of regulation, perhaps we might say, with our Constitution.
So
And
RPR
this would,
helps
yeah,
us be regular. So it's like the X-lax of
exactly.
Just a lot of good fiber.
Sometimes it feels like the opposite of that, whatever the opposite of X-lax is. I mean, but that's what it's supposed to be doing. But then thirdly, that these things that these churches are doing are wise, equitable, and suited to promote the welfare of the church. I'll read 4 and then I'll just come back to 3. And the 4 is obeying lawful injunctions of higher courts. So wherever a higher court gives an injunction, a lawful injunction, a proper injunction to a lower court, it has the right and the duty to make sure that the lower church did that. But of those, the one I think that causes perhaps the most confusion is 3, even more than the idea of recording them correctly, and that is that a higher court has the duty and the right to determine if those actions were wise. You did everything correctly according to format per se. But was it a wise decision? Was it an equitable decision? Was it suited to promote the welfare of the church? Now, I will say that this is an area in which the higher courts ought to and generally do give what is called great deference, right? Great deference to the lower courts because they were there, we were not. They heard all the arguments. You don't record what Ben said on motion 1 and then what Jared said against him. So they were there, they heard the debate. But it is still possible that a church is going to make an unwise decision. And the higher court at least has a right and a duty at the very least to require that lower court to give a further explanation for why they did what they did, why it was wise or equitable, et cetera. And while I've heard this once, I've heard it 1,000 times at RPR, where someone would say, well, we can't look at that decision because they made it, and they, well, no, we can ask the question whether it is wise, but also just reminds us, I think, of what great deference is not absolute unfettered deference. Obviously great deference is a much higher standard than no deference at all or just some deference. But if you say you were to give great deference to a lower court, that doesn't mean you cannot ever, under any circumstances, say that their decision was unwise. It just raises the bar higher in terms of determining that and making that thing. Yeah, so those are the 4 areas. The minutes then are what are taken up by the higher courts to take a look at and to go through. There's one phrase in 40-3, another phrase that causes some confusion with regard to judicial matters. There is this old wives' tale in the PCA that a higher court cannot look at the minutes of a judicial case at all, or anything in the minutes that have to do with judicial matters. That is not what the BCO says. Rather, it clearly indicates that judicial matters do not come under the review of a higher court while notice of appeal or complaint has been given. And it is sometimes argued that the while subordinate clause is meaningless and pointless, that the main clause is the only one you look at. But I think just sort of English composition, English understanding, it's clear that once a judicial matter has been completed and either there are no appeals or complaints or they've all been adjudicated or whatever, that a higher court can look at those, the records of judicial matters. However, the other important piece to that, though, is to remember that while a higher court can review the minutes of a judicial matter and could even find exception to some or potentially even all of the judicial proceedings, that judicial decisions cannot be overturned by review and control. They can only be overturned by complaint or appeal. And so even if a session or a presbytery just completely botched a case, but there was no complaint or appeal, RPR, again, I'll use that phrase, not only has the right, it has the duty to indicate to that presbytery, here are the 15 errors you made, and you need to respond that you understand and that you will endeavor to do better in the future. But no action of a higher court can overturn a judicial matter except by complaint or appeal.
So RPR is not the Standing Judicial Commission.
No, and I will say that with few exceptions of certain individuals from different times who've been there, nobody in RPR thinks they're the SJC either. We tend to have a pretty good understanding of what our role is, and even when we see errors in a judicial matter that has been completed and there's no chance for it to be appealed or complained against, we still need to point out to a presbytery, you did it wrong. And there's no way it can be overturned, but at that point it just becomes a learning experience for the presbytery, because we certainly don't want them to repeat it again simply because we didn't point it out to them. Hey, that's not how you do it. So all of that then refers to the minutes that are read. 40-4 is a very wise paragraph in the midst of a very wise chapter, in the midst of a very wise book, because it understands that certainly when a presbytery neglects to do what it's supposed to do, they're not going to put that in their minutes. Like if they fail to do something, then they're not going to put it in their minutes because they didn't do anything. But also if they are allowing gross errors in their presbytery knowingly, they're also unlikely to put that in their minutes either, right? They're going to try to hide those things that they know higher courts won't like. Now, that's not to suggest that goes on. That's not to suggest this is a rampant problem in the Presbyterian world, but rather it is to understand that there may be issues that ought to be reviewed, but are not in the minutes for a variety of reasons. And our BCO has this phrase that if the higher court is well advised of the actions of a lower court, either that they neglected to do something they needed to do, or that they did something improperly, they can take up that matter as if it were in the minutes, even though it's not. Now, obviously, you're on thinner ice and shaky your ground because you have no actual record of it. And the well-advised portion would have to be defended in some way. But it does mean that from time to time, it is possible that a higher court could bring an exception when a court utterly fails to record something in their minutes at all, because there is secondary evidence or whatever that they did something that they should not have done. And then lastly, the 40-5, which is when there's a credible report that comes to a higher court of some important delinquency or grossly unconstitutional proceedings, that the lower court can be cited to appear before the higher court to give an answer for what they did or failed to do. The intention here is to use language that suggests these are extraordinarily rare events, important delinquency, grossly unconstitutional proceedings. So this wouldn't be something, ideally, this is not something that happens once a year, maybe not even once a decade, but to allow the higher court to still exercise its responsibility of jurisdiction over lower courts, even when there is no minutes or something along those lines. And certainly at the General Assembly level, that means that if there's a 40-5 report regarding a presbytery, that it would ultimately go to the SJC. So that kind of covers just sort of the basics, the background. I didn't know if you guys had any other questions so far. put you all to sleep.
We're good.
Okay. Right. So let's talk a little bit about process then, like how this actually works. And most of this is gonna come out of the RAO, the Rules of Assembly Operation, which are kind of like the standing rules of the General Assembly. Well, they're not kind of like, they are the standing rules of the General Assembly. So RAO 8-5.9 provides for the Committee for the Review of Presbytery Records. It also provides the makeup of that committee, but the committee is composed of one member from each presbytery. They serve 3-year terms, and ideally they are supposed to rotate back and forth between ruling elders and teaching elder delegates. Doesn't always happen. I know, for instance, well, again, I mean, I've served on it like 12 years in a row, and I was always willing. I mean, if any ruling elder would want to go in my place, I would have been happy to cede my seat for 3 years, and see if another teaching elder, for that matter, wanted to go. But volunteering for RPR is not terribly often or even exuberant in the PCA. So
Wait, I thought RPR was like the Disney World of Presbyterian courts.
I've heard they have T-shirts.
We don't have T-shirts. One year we got Howie Donahoe brought beer koozies, so there's that. But
They have RPR on it, like it says it.
I'll come back to that one because there's a story behind that. So, but no, that's the only thing. We do get cute little name tags you get to slap on your chest, and a stack of paper that would make Scott Edberg happy to move around. So those men gather together once a year, well, prior to the assembly in Atlanta for the actual meeting. Just kind of continuing through chapter 16 of REO covers the review of presbytery records. So if either you want to know more or have trouble sleeping at night, turn to REO 16 for that. 16.3 provides guidelines to presbyteries for keeping minutes, but also in one sense provides the base, kind of a baseline for a lot of the things that RPR looks at when they take up the minutes of the various presbyteries. Probably the thing that most people are aware of are the findings from that review that come in the form of exceptions. And so there are 3 broad types of findings. There's an exception of substance, an exception of form, and a notation. Notation is probably the easiest one, so let's just get that out of the way quickly. That's spelling error, typographical error, grammatical error, things like that. Those are not reported to the assembly. They're just simply given to the clerk for just sort of advice to try to clean up their own records or whatever else, or maybe not make mistakes like that in the future. But the other 2 are probably a little bit better well known. Only exceptions of substance are reported to the assembly, but every member of the assembly is also a member of the presbytery, and so they probably received reports that have not just the exceptions of substance, but also the exceptions of form. So the REO defines an exception of substance as an apparent violation of the scripture or serious irregularities from the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church in America, actions out of accord with the deliverances of the General Assembly, and matters of impropriety and important delinquencies, and any non-compliance with REO 16-3.E.5. Those are all reported under that category. And just for those who haven't memorized REO 16, 3.E.5 is how a presbytery is to judge the stated differences of candidates for ordination and I think licensure as well. So you come forward and you give your stated difference, and you are granted an exception by the presbytery. It has to be judged in one of 3, I think it's 3 categories. Out of accord, not out of accord, but not striking at the vitals, or merely semantic, to give a broad general categorization of those things. So again, those are exceptions of substance. Exceptions of form are then violations of the Assembly's guideline for keeping Presbytery minutes. That's REO 16-3 that I mentioned a minute ago. Rules of order, so like Robert's rules violations, things like that. These are normally reported under that category. And one other thing is helpful to note too, that it's possible, although not automatic, that if a presbytery continues to make the same exception of form over and over and over again, then it's possible that it raises up to an exception of substance. If a presbytery just out and out refuses to open their meeting with prayer, that's an exception of form. But if they do it over and over and over again and just refuse to make changes, then it can become an exception of substance. The other big difference as well is obviously notations are just for the sake of the clerk. Exceptions of form are for the sake of the clerk and the presbytery. And then exceptions of substance are given to the whole assembly. But it is only exceptions of substance that the presbytery has to respond to. So they don't respond about exceptions of form. They only respond about exceptions of substance.
So what happens within the committee and that meeting if you're debating something about whether it should be taken to that level, and there's people on both sides? What happens if you have almost a split room on that? Some people want to send it up, some people don't. What happens then?
Well, I mean, so the General Assembly receives the committee's report, which contains all of the exceptions of substance. I mean, any recommendation that the majority of the body made. But I think getting at what you're asking, if there is a sizable minority, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but there are some requirements for how many that has to be, teaching and ruling elders. I think it's 8, but don't quote me on that. If there's a sizable minority, they can file a minority report, which is due, before the assembly even meets, and it's always included in RPR's report, so that the assembly would have both the committee's report, that let's say they want to make something an exception of substance, and then a minority report could come forward that would make something, an exception of form, just to give the example of what we were just talking about. That's never happened on this issue. I mean, typically, we will figure out the room, because the room is different every year. Where are we gonna draw those lines between what's a form, what's a substance? And we'll have, one or two pretty drag out debates that might last, half an hour sometimes on one of these particular issues. But then once it's decided, most people realize that it's important, but it's not that important. It's not something to bring to the assembly, because, again, an exception of substance, even if you thought, no, that really needs to be an exception of form, it shouldn't be substance. I mean, at the end of the day, the only difference is that the presbytery has to report back on it. And so that one is not that big of a deal. But obviously, the broader parameters of that question, anytime there is a sizable minority, you can get a minority report. And the minority report, kind of brings with it two different things. First of all, a general eye rolling and sigh from the assembly when they find out that one's coming. That's the one thing. But the other, it really does get an opportunity for the assembly to decide something where there is a sizable disagreement within the committee. And so, while it does take up extra time and it does kind of slow things down at the assembly level, that's how it's designed to work. And so they can be tedious at times, but they're important. So. But let's see. So there's one other thing that I wanted to say, because in one sense, if you go back to 16.6 with regard to exceptions of substance and exception of form, they have what I would describe as great descriptions of them, but not a definition, right? So this is part of the art of RPR. You know, where do you draw that line? And I tend to think of it personally this way. So this is just me. This is not the way RPR always looks at it. But if you just think about the language that is being used, you know, the difference between a substance and a form. I mean, this is almost you know, Thomistic language in a sense. But you know, a substance in one sense is referring to the matter itself, right? The thing that was done should not have been done, or it should not have been done the way it was done. But form to me seems to refer not to matter but to manner. Hopefully, I'm enunciating well enough. Manner, the way a thing was recorded versus the way it was done. And that, you know, even then, that's not going to get you to the end of the discussion, but it's helpful for me a lot of times when thinking through those things. I'll also say that the stated clerk's office provides every year a list of recommendations for what should be form or substance. And it lists, you know, I don't know, 50 or so different exceptions that might be found, and then gives a recommendation for whether that should be form or substance and where you'd find that in the Book of Church Order or the RAO or even Robert's Rules for that matter. And I'll say too that the clerk provides it. It was created and continues to be modified by the RPR committee. So it's not just, you know, the clerk off on his own trying to figure that out. It's the RPR year after year that continues to massage that thing. But it does provide some really good ways of kind of thinking through a lot of that. And then, so I want to talk a little bit about the report then as it comes, and we'll talk a little more about the process here in a second. But when the report comes, there are the recommendations concerning the minutes. These are the exceptions of substance that they are recommending the assembly approve. It's probably as good a time as ever to just remind ourselves that committees make recommendations. They don't take actions themselves, and so every item in the report is a recommendation that the assembly do those things. And so I know it's common way of speaking to say, well, RPR cited us with an exception of substance, and every presbytery that I'm in, I remind men, no, RPR did nothing. The assembly cited you with an exception of substance. RPR made a recommendation, but it was the assembly that cited it. So the report, the bulk of that report is recommendations. I would draw everyone's attention to REO 16-7.d, which in a amazing sweep of I don't know what, lists any other recommendation. RPR can make, according to the REO, it can make any recommendation it wants. I'm certain that wasn't intended, but the rules as written, which I'm a rules as written guy, 16-7D, any other recommendation.
So if RPR just wanted to make a recommendation that the General Assembly was adjourned at the end of its report, then it can ask for that.
It could make the recommendation. I doubt it would pass, but maybe adjourn, you know, for something. But you know, this came up an issue last year with the 40-5 that was raised for Metro New York, and now this wasn't necessarily an argument that was made because it wasn't really challenged on the floor in terms of whether it was appropriate or not, at least appropriate from a rules perspective. But I know in some of the subsequent conversations that I know I've had, I mean, this is as sweeping as it gets, and it's not something you make up. It clearly, any other recommendation. Now, certainly it needs to have it should have something to do with review and control, right? It shouldn't be you know, to fire the coordinator of whatever, you know, committee or anything like that. But it certainly leaves a lot of leeway to make other recommendations. But actually, I mean, you step back a second and think about it. Even outside of that, the RPR may be the broadest report in terms of scope that we receive at the assembly. committee of commissioner reports, you vote them up, you vote them down, you can refer them back, but you cannot amend a COC report. You do nothing with the SJC's report other than, maybe grumble some people, but you can't do anything about it. Nominations, the time for nominations from the floor is already, there's nothing you can do. RPR is entirely amendable from the floor. And that means that, and this has happened numerous times where a presbyter would stand up from, what XYZ Presbytery would say, no, they got it wrong. I have it here in my minutes right here. We did that thing. And the assembly can move to strike that exception of substance or change it, right? This has happened too, where maybe an exception of substance is unclear. It's slipped through the committee. And so somebody makes an amendment on the floor to make it more clear. But it also means that someone could, in theory, stand up in the middle of the RPR report, maybe not in the middle, wait till you're recognized by the chair, and move to just add an entirely new exception to the report. I mean, that's never happened, and I doubt it would go very far. But just the fact that it's possible, overtures is certainly not like that. This is the only one I'm aware of, I can think of off the top of my head, that is anything like this when it comes to the floor. It's also the one that has tended, as we were talking about a minute ago, just to have the most minority reports. You get occasionally, you'll get some out of overtures, but maybe it's just anecdotal thinking and maybe it's wrong. But I think over the last, 15 years or whatever that I've been going to the assembly, it seems clear that there have been more minority reports out of RPR than overtures, or maybe they're neck and neck, but pretty close. And so it does tend to be one of those reports where the room tends to fill back up again. Lots of people want to be there just, for all kinds of, interesting things that might be brought up and spoken about. So that's the report. And then just in terms of responding, then presbyteries are required to respond to the exceptions of substance that the assembly cites them with. These things are findings, right? They're findings of the assembly, but they're not finalized. The presbytery, again, it has a response. In fact, they have to respond to the assembly. And that response can be something like, yes, you're right, we did that wrong, we won't do it again. We'll correct our minutes, assuming it's possible to correct the minutes, not always, or correct the action. And 99 times out of 100, well, let's say 75 times out of 100, that's what they say, and that's what happens, and those are found satisfactory. Occasionally, however, their response is unsatisfactory for a variety of reasons, and then they are required to respond to the next year's General Assembly again. And so sometimes that can go back and forth, sometimes for many years, but there is sort of an exit ramp for that. Eventually, when the presbytery and the assembly cannot agree, it will go back, it will go to the SJC. And again, that's important because it's not RPR and the presbytery that are going back and forth. Really, it's the assembly and the presbytery that are going back and forth. And I think that raises an interesting idea, right? That it's not the assembly itself, nor even the presbytery, and it certainly isn't RPR, that is going to be making a final decision in disputed matters. But rather, if that dispute continues to go on and to be unresolved, it goes ultimately to the SJC, acting in its capacity as the judicial commission of the General Assembly. That is where that final decision is made. And so, yeah, so the meeting, I guess I really didn't talk much about that. We meet, as I said, for a couple of days 3 days actually, in Atlanta, a few weeks prior to the assembly. We spend an enormous amount of time just discussing, debating, going through the recommendations, the read reports from the various different individuals.
Another hiccup. Are you there, Steve? Are you there?
Thank you for joining us for Polity Matters. And we will see you next time for NomCom.
Oh man, he dropped. There he is.
Okay,
Hey.
sorry. Sorry about that.
It's at the 40-minute limit of the Zoom call.
No, we pay for the privilege of having more than 40 minutes.
Is that my
Oh, there you
warning?
go.
Well, my internet is not all that good here, so so you might have to find a place where to kind of cut all that out, because I realized after I started talking that I actually did have what I was saying a little bit later on, but there was one other thing I wanted to say. Um, so just to kind of get back into it, then um, um, I've thought about, if the BCO gave us a description for kissing your wife. I'm glad it doesn't do that, but if it did say how to kiss your wife in the BCO, I imagine it would turn, what is supposed to be a thoroughly enjoyable exercise sound like a bore and a chore to do. And sometimes, RPR is a little bit like that. It is not quite like kissing your wife, I don't think. But it's a lot more exciting than our BCO, fun, enjoyable, maybe, than our BCO makes it sound. And I just wanted to mention then the importance of that. Again, I know I said this a minute ago early on, but it seems to me to be kind of the primary and the ordinary way that we remain a Presbyterian denomination, not just a collection of churches, not just an association, but an actual Presbyterian denomination. That we have, a mutual trust and love for one another. But wasn't it Reagan? We trust, but we verify. We look at those minutes, and really, it's just a reflection of, what is true for me as an individual is also true for us when we gather together in courts. I have an enormous need for mutual accountability. If it wasn't for my session, for my friends that I know, for my wife, then who knows where I would go and what I would do and what my thoughts would be and all those things. I need that mutual accountability, and even outside of that, right? It's possible, even for the wisest among us, the most knowledgeable among us, it's possible to make mistakes, to leave out an important matter, or to overlook something. Jared and I were together for almost 12 years in Ascension Presbytery with, one of the most wise, most knowledgeable, most experienced stated clerks, Jay Nykirk. And occasionally our minutes would come back with exceptions of substance. So it's important to remember, even those who really know what they're doing can still make mistakes and benefit from others looking in on it. But even outside of that review and control from the upper level, I think, again, just the importance of minutes themselves. We don't take minutes so that a higher court can, kind of peer into our business and stick their nose in the middle of what we're doing. That minutes are first and foremost a record for whatever court is making those minutes. Right? It's so they will know what they have done. They have a historical record that they can go back and look to. What did we do 5 years ago or 10 years ago? How did we handle something like this before? Is that man even ordained in this presbytery? Well, we can go back and find the minutes for that and figure that out. But also, minutes are an important part of how we make decisions, of what it means for a court to make a decision. Are we willing to put that action, that motion, are we willing to put it in our minutes to have future generations of that court, much less higher courts, know what we did, what we were willing to do or unwilling to do? Even for individuals, right, to have your submission to your brothers in the Lord tied to that particular action, right? To be on record in one sense of having to be willing, according to your vows, to submit to that decision, however much you may have argued against it. And so minutes are important for that. They are an important record of what we have done, yes, for higher courts, but also for us, so that we will know who we are and what it is that we have done as courts together. Lastly, then, just want to talk a little bit, sorry, about the process. So our RPR is where Robert's Rules nerds go on vacation. They don't go to Disney World. They go to Atlanta at the end of May. although some people describe it as the ninth circle of hell. So I'm not really sure which one it is. Maybe it's a little bit of both. But it is a 3-day, most expenses paid meeting in Atlanta a couple of weeks before the General Assembly. The minutes of the presbyteries are submitted electronically. A 3-man read team is going to get together and they will examine. Each of them will get the same 3 to 4 presbyteries. They'll read them over individually, and then they'll come together for what's called a read team meeting. It just provides sort of a second read, a check and balance. Somebody might see something that I didn't. I might see something that they didn't. Or we might dispute even and debate even there about whether something really is an exception or whether it's exception of form or substance or whatever. And then a read team report is created that is collated before we get there. This is a rather new process. So some people that maybe have been on RPR, 5-10 years ago may not recognize it, but that's the way we've been doing it for, I think, 3 years anyway. And one of the things that does is it allows us to arrive in Atlanta on Wednesday morning and to begin immediately doing the work of the committee instead of having to collate and do second reads and do all of those things. And then there is the perfecting of the report. And we go presbytery by presbytery, starting now, I guess, with Arizona. We used to start with Ascension and just go one after the other, exception by exception. We look at substances first, and then we look at forms, then we look at notations, and then we look at the responses to previous year's exceptions, and it just goes on and on and on and on. One year, we did start at the other end. We started with the W's, I think, and we worked our other direction back.
You just nuke him?
No, I was just looking at what Jared sent.
We nuked you, I guess.
Yeah, you don't like me. Okay, this is like, trying to get you off the stage. I'm almost done, guys. Come on now. And feel free to cut out whatever you want to. So, and
I'm just dropping this raw file on the internet somewhere and see if anybody else wants to do it.
Stitch it together 3 ways. Yeah. So then it's a lot like overtures. I know a lot of guys have served on it, or maybe they sit in and observe in terms of, lots of motions, points of orders, amendments, on and on. It's like overtures, but it's just not as exciting as overtures is usually. Although every once in a while we will get into a pretty sticky debate that might last for, sometimes a couple of hours even, debating, some issue. Thinking about like one of the more recent ones about, whatever presbytery it was, I can't remember, that was that denied a man the right to teach. The exception or the stated difference that they had granted him an exception to. I think it might have been Calvary. Yeah. And
Northwest Georgia.
Debate, well, I think most of the debate was over Calvary because they came up first. And by the time we got to North Georgia, it was like ditto. But yeah, you're right. There were 2 of them. And the debate on Calvary was several hours long because it's a committee. You can't call the question in a committee. So it just goes on and on and on. But most of it is pretty routine, but certainly necessary. So lastly, I just want to also give kind of an appeal to all those who are listening. At this point, all 5 who are still listening to me drone on about RPR.
Well, no, here, I can set you up for that. So listening to you talk, I've already texted the chairman of our Presbytery NomCom and asked, hey, do we I don't know if we have anybody on RPR right now. Because it sounds like a great place to go if you're into polity or if you want to learn more. So yeah, convince us.
Okay. So I'll bring up sausage again. There's a little bit of kind of, I know. There's a little bit of kind of sausage making to it, where, if you like hot dogs, do not go to a hot dog factory. So sometimes it can be like that. It can ruin people. But at the same time, if you like polity, if you like the BCO, if you like the REO, if you like Robert's Rules of Order, or even if maybe you don't like them yet, but you just want to know more about them. You want to learn more about those pieces of our of our denomination, there really is no better place to go than RPR. You will learn about, again, the finer points of Robert's rules, and then again, just how our Constitution works, how that process works. I would say that a lot of what I know about, particularly about Robert's rules, but even just about our BCO, has just come from being on RPR for so long, learning alongside other guys and just sitting through that process. And so, on the one hand, you get this great benefit of learning more about kind of how the sausage is made, yes. But you also experience some things that most people probably don't realize go on at RPR. An RPR report by design are all the things the Presbytery did wrong, right? But what we get to do both as first readers and also as we come alongside one another and talk through the conversation, we get to see some of the things that the presbyteries did well, right? We get to see some of what God by his grace is actually doing in our denomination. Right? We get to see men ordained to gospel ministry. We get to see churches planted. Even sometimes watching sort of as a fly on the wall, like watching the discipline unfold, even that can be a blessing because you remember that's one of the marks of the church. And while you, I guess in one sense, deplore the necessity for it in that particular instance, whatever it might be, but the fact that a presbytery is endeavoring to be a church and to deal with discipline issues in and of itself can be encouraging. Maybe they made a lot of errors or whatever else, and that's but just the idea of it is great. In fact, this year I was reading through one of the particular presbyteries that I have, and they had attached these reports from every church. I don't remember how many churches they had in the presbytery, but they divided them up evenly amongst their stated meetings, and each church gave a paragraph of all the ways that God was blessing them in that presbytery. And it was good for me just to read that and just to be reminded that it's not all doom and gloom out there. I mean, the churches are flourishing, experiencing time of great blessings from God. And you'll never read that in the report. But if you go to RPR and you participate, you might actually get to experience some of that. I know I certainly have every year. But also, it's a time of fellowship with presbyters that you might not normally or otherwise ever get to know. I was actually reflecting on this last year at General Assembly. I was walking down the aisle and I looked around, and I've been around for some time, not as long as I know. Many guys have been in the PCA longer than I have, but I think 15 years or so is a decent amount of time. And I feel like I know a lot of people, and yet as I looked down this particular aisle, I didn't recognize a single person. Right? There are just so many ruling elders and teaching elders in this denomination that there's no way you can get to know them all. But then on the other hand, right, for better or for worse, we tend to have friends that more or less align with us in terms of our outlook, of our doctrinal stances, et cetera. And RPR is no different in terms of at the meeting, there are sometimes, unfortunately, very clear lines that are drawn between one side and the other along kind of doctrinal issues, et cetera. But one of the things that one of our members did early on when I was started to go, this is ruling elder Howie Donahoe, former moderator of the assembly, longtime member of SJC. Howie's probably one of those people that needs no introduction. But after, what we would do is this was going on forever. After the meeting, let's say Wednesday night, we would, reconvene out on the patio of the Hampton Inn for a time of PCA refreshment, pipes, cigars, and alcohol. But more than that, what Howie was able to do is to encourage us not to sort of gather in two different groups that evening to complain about the PCA or whatever, but actually everybody to get together and just mix and talk. And those have been some of my most enjoyable experiences in all of my work in any court, whether it's session, presbytery, or the assembly. Really having an opportunity to talk to other men and not to talk about, although there's a little bit of this, not talking about our differences or whatever else, but just to get a chance to talk to men about, what was going on in their churches, what was going on in their family, what was going on, in the cities in which they're ministering, and all of those different kind of things. Really, to get to know people. I mean, that doesn't mean that I didn't argue against their position the next morning, but it does mean that I have a greater respect for them, and people that, you get to know them not as an advocate for a position or an ideology, for lack of a better word. You get to know them as a human being, as a presbyter, as a pastor, and that has been, really invaluable to me. It's helped me, I feel, in so many other areas of denominational work, that guys who, again, might disagree with my opinions on something, but they've gotten to know me through RPR, and I've gotten to know them, and we know we disagree, but we also know we're both men of integrity, that we hold those positions sincerely, and that we can still call one another brothers because we have, shared a old fashioned together or something like that. So,
Well, we've gotten a good deep dive on RPR. Jared, we're going to circle back to NomCom another time, but just wanted to check in with Scott or Jared. See any other things on your minds about RPR you want to ask Steve before we get going? You guys all right? Y'all knew how this was done beforehand, didn't you? Okay. Well, as the Committee for Review of Presbytery Records would say, this podcast is over. Thanks for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about what we've mentioned, check the show notes out. There's a few things up there for you. You can find those in your podcast player or at politymatters.org. We're always glad to have Steve Tipton on the show. Many thanks to you, sir, for joining us. We appreciate your input and contributions. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider following us on Twitter or Facebook at Polity Matters. Subscribe in your podcast app of choice. And if you have questions or comments, you can always reach out to us on social media or at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. You can find each one of us on Twitter. You can check the show notes for the proper links. But for now, thanks again for spending time with us. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, gentlemen.
Scott's waving. Y'all take care.